Like many of you, it was Market Square's mission statement that drew me here. I've shared before that I was also drawn in by the 2021 Advent devotional booklet, written by members and produced by our anti-racism task force. In that devotional booklet, people shared openly and honestly about their journeys regarding race. And as I prepared to preach today on Juneteenth, I thought it only fair for me to share some of my own journey regarding race. My awareness of race, my seeking to understand cultural and societal issues around race, and most importantly, my growing awareness of my own complicity in the prejudice and racism inherent in the United States. I ask that you receive my story with grace. I do not share to be lauded for taking the journey. It's what we all need to do to be a part of God's redemptive work in regard to racism. Some of the story makes even me cringe, so cringe away. But right now, this is where I am and from where I've come. And I share in the hope that in my story, you'll recognize some of your own story. And if you haven't been willing to think about issues of prejudice and racism in your own life, you'll begin to do so. And while I hope that everyone listening can take something from my preaching this morning, I wrote this sermon intentionally to address those who, like myself, are white. I was born less than a year after the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I grew up in suburban New Jersey, outside of Newark, until the 4th grade when my parents moved to Morristown, New Jersey. I'm not one who has a lot of distinct memories of my childhood, but I don't remember any Black children in my childhood. Not until classes in middle school in Morristown. I'm sure they were there, but my family didn't have any significant relationships with anyone who wasn't white. My most distinct memory of spending time with a Black child was when my parents hosted a young girl through the Fresh Air Fund. For those of you who don't know, that's a program which seeks to connect children from New York City with homes in the suburbs to get them out of the city for fresh air. I don't remember much about that young girl, but I do remember we did a lot of fun stuff that week. And I also remember wondering, what is so special about this young girl that would occasion all these activities? If my parents had any other conversation with me, I don't recall it. In my own larger family of origin, I can remember vague language and some specific instances that contributed to the prejudice I must now acknowledge I was taught. Not taught purposefully, not directly, but in the same way so many of us in this country are taught prejudice and the fear and discomfort that goes with it. There were offhand comments about a Black neighbor being one of the good ones. Family covertly shushing, but not in any way challenging elders who used inappropriate names for Black people. As I learned to drive, there was instruction to always lock one's doors when getting off the highway and arriving in the city, especially if there were people around. There was no mention of race in that instruction, but the redlining and white flight of earlier decades meant that our cities were largely populated by Blacks and suburbs largely populated by whites. And I simply accepted as wisdom what I was taught and the way my family interacted around race. In high school, we moved to the main line of Philadelphia, and there was one Black family with 2 boys my age who lived directly behind us in the affluent neighborhood where my parents settled. And I remember our two families having a cordial but not close relationship. And all of us kids were in school together. And that school had a tradition that at holidays, sports teams and clubs would raise money by having carnations that you could purchase and send to another student, either named or anonymously. One carnation for $1 delivered during homeroom. I remember it clearly. One St. Patrick's Day, I received a flower anonymously, and it later came to my attention that it was from one of our Black neighbors. As I remember it, I brought the flower home and shared the news with some excitement. My excitement wasn't exactly met. I was subtly encouraged not to jump to any conclusion about what a flower might mean. And even though it might not mean anything, I was not so subtly encouraged to think twice about the difficulty of entering into a relationship that would potentially be difficult because of differences of race. I remember feeling frustrated, but I didn't pursue the subject or the relationship. It wasn't until I entered college, Tufts University, in the fall of 1987 that I became even a little aware of the prejudice ingrained in my upbringing and in my being. At Tufts, there were more, but not a lot, of Black students, some racial diversity. 1987 was also the year that Eyes on the Prize was produced by PBS. And in the fall after my second year, a fellow student asked if I would lead a peer group of new students with him. The subject matter for those conversations was going to be race relations. We watched and discussed the Eyes on the Prize series and also Spike Lee's movie, Do the Right Thing. I remember feeling ill-equipped to lead those conversations, and I was. The series and film were eye-opening for me, a part of the history of this country about which I only had a vague understanding. I remember feeling uncomfortable and convicted, and rightfully so. I also remember our Dean of Students, Bobby Nabel, who in a talk she gave acknowledged that those feelings might come up, and she invited anyone who wished to come and talk with her. As busy as I now realize she must have been, she did make the time for every student to do that. And I went. She was a Black woman. And when I went to see her, she, of course, received me with grace. I remember that something I said led her to apologize to me for my discomfort. And when I look back on that now, I cringe. I wasn't mature enough to own that discomfort, nor to allow it to propel me into further exploration and relationship as it could have. Instead, I whined about it. I'm going to fast forward to seminary because there wasn't a whole lot going on in regard to this journey. While I finished college, went to graduate school for lighting, and worked in theater and architecture for a time, those worlds, at least as I experienced them, were predominantly, overwhelmingly white. In seminary in Atlanta, that changed again. There were still few Black students, but the feelings of discomfort about my lack of connection were getting stronger, and this time I did pay attention. In my second year there, I took a class called something like Race and the Gospel with Dr. Marcia Riggs, who at that time was one of only a handful of Black faculty members. Out of the whole seminary, there were 8 of us in that class. We were almost equally divided between white and Black. Thanks be to God that she and the Black students who took that class did not shy away from asking all of us to name and explore the feelings we had. I remember the first time a fellow student referred to me as a European American. A what? That was eye-opening. To be reminded that my family too was from somewhere else, and you know what? They probably had a choice in whether they came here, I was told. I remember one of my classmates sharing in tears about her elementary-aged daughter's tears. And those tears came from thinking that she was ugly because her skin was so dark. And I remember taking my first implicit bias test through Harvard University's website and stupidly being shocked that the results showed that I was prejudiced. I will forever be grateful for that opportunity and for the vulnerability of everyone there. The journey has continued. There's more I could share, but I hope that's enough to demonstrate my point. My point is that even though no one intended to teach me prejudice or fear of Black people or discomfort around issues of race, it happened. All of that has been a part of white culture since we first sought to justify the enslavement of Black people, and I internalized it, as did so many of those who came before and after me. Jesus freed a man possessed by demons and restored him to his right mind. Let's not worry too much about that word demon. We'll treat it metaphorically. There was something in that man's life from which he needed to be freed. He knew it. He came to Jesus for it. And many of us are possessed by a legion of demons representing prejudice, fear, discomfort, and the racism to which those feelings can lead. Racism is prejudice, fear, and discomfort combined with power, which white people have had. Simply put, power enables one to alleviate fear by enacting laws or creating systems which control those whom one fears or is prejudiced against. Slavery and Jim Crow are two obvious examples. Now, we are not those who owned enslaved persons. Hopefully, we aren't those who directly hurt or participated in the many lynchings of Black Americans, and likely, none of us is responsible for putting racist systems in place. But if you have white skin, you have reaped the benefits of those racist systems, because they have made it easier for white people and harder for Black people to thrive in our country. And I know that most of us here desire an end to those systems. But sometimes even those of us with good intentions rush to loud self-righteousness without being willing to do the difficult work of examining our own history and complicity. Without that examination, the possibility for inadvertently perpetuating racist systems or even the enactment of new ones is still present. Our current arguments about access to voting versus the risk of voter fraud are an example of this. In our story, the demon had to be named before it could be exorcised, and we too must work with the Holy Spirit's help to name and confront our fear and prejudice, and only then can we be freed from those demons and restored to our right minds. But we must be prepared. For when the man in our story was freed of his demons, instead of celebrating his release, townspeople were afraid, and they mourned their economic loss. And this, too, is a metaphor warning to us. Too often, money and economic success are more important than people. To undo the effects of the racist systems from which we with white skin have benefited economically, we'll have to let go of some of our privilege. And that is not easy. The first time I wrote this sermon, I wrote that we had to, in quotes, I'm putting air quotes here, make sacrifices. But my daughter, who is my astute editor today, said that the word sacrifice didn't sit well with her. And she's right, because a sacrifice connotes you are giving something up that is rightfully yours. The privileges we've reaped from the enslavement and oppression of Black people are not rightfully ours. How we make up for all of that, slavery and Jim Crow, the unequal application of the GI Bill after World War II, the outright taking of Black life and destruction of Black-owned property, for the gaps in wealth that have grown again during COVID, how we make up for that, I do not know. But I do know it will not happen without each of us taking a long, hard look at our own lives and asking for help to rid ourselves of those demons. In the end, the freed man wants to stay with Jesus, but Jesus says, no. What I really need is for you to talk to your kin, to those here in this town, and share the story of what God has done for you. What I've shared today is my way of doing that. I hope it's been helpful to you. And please know that I am open to any questions, critique, or challenges that you may have about what I have shared. No matter how difficult, I hope for the courage to continue this work, becoming free. And I pray for the same Spirit-given desire and the willingness to act on it for all of you. Amen.